There's been an incredible amount of discussion recently about Suzu and about Kiriko's position as really the mainstay hero of Overwatch 2. So I wanted to quickly go over how, from a macro and default playstyle perspective, Suzu is almost essential in 5v5, and also to have a look at some of the dangers of trying to balance it out of use, even if it isn't ideal in its current state. Teamfights in Overwatch are a game of resources, and by shifting those resources around and using them more intelligently, or particularly with more mechanical skill than our opponents, we can gain a local advantage. Our tank might force the enemy tank's cooldowns first, a DPS might hit a good shot in a duel and force their opponent to back up, or we might rotate in a way that gives us a numbers or angle advantage in an area of the map. Forcing enemy resources and recognizing that local advantage, then applying pressure along that avenue to snowball it into a fight win, is generally how fights are won in Overwatch. Now, back in 6v6, we had an off-tank that played heavily around this idea of local advantages, since when a player was losing a duel, or the enemy had concentrated their resources or ultimates into trying to burst a player, our off-tank would be there to absorb that local disadvantage for the time it took the rest of the team to react, either by peeling for the players under threat, or by taking advantage of the attention and cooldowns being absorbed by those players by going for their own play. Crucially, this also allowed players to take positions and play angles beyond their own ability to keep themselves alive, since a DPS could take a greedy angle, or supports could rotate through contested territory, confident in the knowledge that there was an off-tank available to support them when pressured. Particularly for 6v6, this enabled quite a healthy variety in team comps and playstyles, which we saw in the last Overwatch 1 playoffs. Watch the Death of the Anchor video if you want to know more. Once we lost that off-tank in the transition to 5v5, we saw a heavy reliance on mobility and defensive cooldowns, since players were now required to absorb that local disadvantage by themselves. With the crazy amount of burst damage available, a hero that couldn't slide away from enemy pressure like Sojourn, or go into Wraith form like Reaper, would be dead before healing could come in or teammates could go for a trade. In fact, even when playing heroes with those options, the aim of a player under concentrated threat is rarely to survive, but more to ensure they absorb a disproportionate amount of time and resources while dying, to give the rest of their team the best chance of trading onto an enemy team that has already burned through most of their cooldowns. And this is where Kiriko comes in, because in this world of solo tanks, burst damage, and heavily mobile heroes, the one who can instantly teleport to any teammate and make them invincible has clearly inherited that traditional role of the off-tank. When the enemy gain a local advantage and try to press it home, she is able to quickly react to that threat, regardless of LOS, and stop that player from being immediately burst down, thus absorbing her team's local disadvantage and buying them time to react with peel or with a trade, just as the off-tank did in 6v6. If anything, this role is even more important in 5v5 with its faster teamfights, since it's already quite easy to commit too many resources onto an enemy player by sacrificing positions, cooldowns and health pools to get the kill, then getting traded onto by an enemy team with better angles and more resources. Adding Kiriko to that mix makes that mistake even easier, since she's able to negate a lot of that resource commitment and really draw out that disproportionate amount of resources, even if the original target or Kiriko herself still end up dying. Again, the crucial part of this is that players are then able to play in the knowledge that Suzu is available, taking positions and peaking angles outside of the safe allowance of their own kits, where they can apply a high level of pressure that will force enemies to commit resources, typically by being forced to commit to and engage onto the players applying that pressure. Players that have taken those threatening but vulnerable positions, confident that Kiriko and her Suzu will still allow them to absorb enough enemy resources to turn that enemy engage into a fight-losing overcommitment. I'm keen to go more in depth on this, as it's more or less the default playstyle of modern Overwatch, but it's a bit outside the scope of this video. Kiriko's part of it, however, is pretty much exactly what we see in this example. Blue team is forced to commit resources to cross the bridge, and our Vendetta ends up in the house with no cooldowns, no Zarya bubbles available, and relatively split from the rest of the team. This is a pretty typical example of a local disadvantage centered around the Vendetta. Red team recognizes this and tries to exploit it by boosting in with Barrage. However, our Kiriko is able to TP in and absorb that disadvantage, keeping Vendetta alive for the time it takes Zarya to close the distance and help Vendetta catch the Pharah, the Lucio and the D.Va now that those enemies are low on resources. A similar thing happens here, where Cassidy's position peaking high ground and his distance to his Ramatra makes blue team think they recognize a chance to create a local advantage by diving him with sound barrier. Kiriko is able to teleport to him from a safe location and absorb that disadvantage with Suzu for the time it takes the team to disengage and reset. Then, once they re-peak and blue team use their Kiriko ult, creating another local disadvantage via threat of getting burst from range, she is there to absorb that as well. Again, we have to think not just in terms of the micro value she gets from her cooldowns, but how her ability to react to any disadvantage enables the Ramatra to play close to the choke and the Cassidy to play from that threatening position. And just like the old off-tank, this ability to react also enables her team to play for rotations, where there's usually a moment that their tight spacing and lack of angles puts them at a local disadvantage. If they're interrupted, for example with a slam and a minefield, she is there to absorb it. This might not look like the best engage, but if the slam connects, it's quite different. And again, we have to see this from the perspective of Kiriko giving her Sim and Cassidy the confidence to walk out and peek, with the positions they take forcing the timing of this engage, which she is then ready to absorb. We can see a brief example here too, where Kiriko's team has the confidence to muscle a rotation against a Mauga team, because she is able to block both his ignite effect on the charge and the slam itself, absorbing that local disadvantage for the time it takes them to spread out and commit ultimates. For a few reasons, this off-tank aspect of Kiriko might not always be that clear and ranked. Lower time to kill gives players more time to react to teammates under threat anyway, and players can escape easier with just their personal cooldowns. Positioning is also generally worse, both on behalf of the player under threat and the teammates looking to trade out on that absorbed attention, meaning that peeling for the target with Suzu doesn't necessarily mean our team will do anything useful with that time window or the wasted enemy cooldowns. But in high-level matches, this second layer of the game with regards to positioning and resource commitment is critical. Rather than a player on a greedy angle being immediately blown up by the stacks of burst damage available to teams in Overwatch, we can now build a default playstyle around taking those angles and making those plays, confident in the knowledge that if a player can force the enemy to overcommit resources into pushing them, Kiriko is available to punish that commitment. Depending on the meta, these might just be short angles instead of wide flanks, but they will happen pretty much every fight. Players are trying to perform this process with just their own cooldowns anyway, but the confidence in Suzu gives them greedier options for plays and more variety in options for heroes. And this is why, when talking about Suzu, we can't really get caught up in the specific stats and aspects of the ability itself. We have to see it combined with her teleport as what enables Kiriko's role as 5v5's off-tank. And when discussing her balance options, we have to see her through that off-tank lens. There really is a terrifying amount of burst damage in Overwatch, and we have to be careful at balancing out one of the only ways to punish overcommitments of that burst damage that aren't personal mobility or defensive cooldowns. Interplay between roles and heroes is what makes Overwatch an engaging game to play, and we should try to encourage any aspects of interplay that have survived into 5v5.